Hello, I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director at 1014. Together with Steve Sokol, President of the American Council in Germany, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 7th conversation in a series of online discussions organized by the ACG in 1014 under the heading Democracies Under Pressure, Challenges for the Global Liberal Order. In recent years, we have seen internal and external challenges to democracy and waning trust in democratic institutions and practices. We also increasingly see democracies being challenged by authoritarian regimes. First and foremost, China. The war in Ukraine now has added another layer of complications with China and its pro-Russian neutrality. In addition, persistent concerns about Chinese human rights abuses, its zero-COVID policy, unfair trade practices, economic coercion, and military pressure on Taiwan make it likely that China will remain high on the transatlantic agenda. So therefore, we have two experts on China with us today, one from each side of the Atlantic. Dr. Kristin Shi-Kupfer is Professor for Sinology at the University of Trier and a Senior Associate Fellow at MERICS. She is an expert on China's digital politics, media policy, civil society, and human rights. Herzlich willkommen, Kristin.
Dankeschön. Thanks for having me.
And Yun Sun is a Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and also authoritarian regimes. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We are very delighted to have both of you with us today. But before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone that the ACG and 1014 are both independent, non-partisan organizations. So the views expressed during this conversation are those of our two guests.
My warm welcome to our two guests as well. Let me try to set the stage briefly. After officially securing another 5 years as the head of the Chinese Communist Party, President Xi is in a strong position to advance his domestic and foreign policy agendas. And what we thought we would do today is talk both about what's going on within China, but also what's going on in terms of China's role on the world stage. And so we thought we'd maybe start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about your views on Xi's third term. And I thought we could maybe begin by focusing on domestic politics. We'd like to look at questions like, how will Xi and his new team handle the challenges that confront his country at home, like the domestic economic unease and questions around the COVID-19 lockdowns? Yun, I'd like to maybe start with you. After the party Congress, you participated in a discussion that was hosted by the Brookings Institution called Xi's Sweep. We thought that was a really interesting discussion that you had there. And particularly today, reading the news about the rollback of some of the zero COVID rules that were imposed, we've sort of seen a remarkable pivot. I guess the starting question would be, do you think that this relaxation of some of the COVID rules can calm the mood, the atmosphere in China and assuage some of the protesters, and at the same time also improve the economic situation?
Thank you, Steve. That's a terrific question. And I think a month ago, when we had the discussion at Brookings about the 20th Party Congress and its result, nobody saw this coming. And honestly, for the Chinese officials, diplomats, and Chinese watchers in China, nobody saw this coming either. So I think it will be an interesting analytical question as for that how we failed to predict this mass discontent and pushback to the COVID lockdowns that we have seen in China for the past 3 years. We know the trigger, the fire in Urumqi and the government response to the fire, but I think what it has reflected, the widespread social discontent about the zero COVID policy is a really significant political development in China that nobody should underestimate. Is the new measures adopted by the government going to help? Well, to answer that question, we need to look at the origin of the discontent. Are they trying to call for political change, democracy in China, overthrowing the government? Or are they calling for the technical adaptation of the COVID-related restrictions? I think there have been several sporadic single cases where the demonstrators targeted Xi Jinping and Chinese Communist Party. But across the board, what we have seen more is people having had enough with COVID restrictions. So in that sense, I would say the government policy, the adaptation to mitigate some of the restrictions and to return people to a more mobile and free state of being is going to meet a lot of the demand that we have seen on the ground. And whether that's going to lead to a higher level of satisfaction and also economic growth to recover from this, we believe so, but it will take time to transpire.
So let me push you on that for just a little bit, and then bring Kristin into the conversation. People have had enough, right? So there's been tremendous pressure on the government by the population. We've seen protests, we've seen crackdowns on those protests. And so we've got one sort of scenario unfolding when you think about the domestic discontent and dissatisfaction. On the other hand, you've got this policy by the government of no COVID. We have the possibility now of seeing a surge in infections. It seems from a public health standpoint that it might be a bit of a risky gamble to sort of alleviate some of these restrictions at this time. So how do you see these two sort of competing scenarios unfolding?
That's a great point. I think for the Beijing's decision making, it has always been a calculus, right? There's going to be pros and cons for each and a single scenario. So the most pressing task for Beijing is to identify which one is of higher priority and which cost significantly overweighs the other. I think in the past, what the Beijing have decided is that the public health risks that is carried by a complete opening up is going to be too significant. Well, one of the main reasons was because it was before the 20th Party Congress, and the government was not going to allow for a mass infection of COVID, which could give Xi Jinping's political opponents excuses or give them ammunition to attack Xi Jinping's policy before the 20th Party Congress. So now you could argue that the 20th Party Congress is over. Xi Jinping's top one domestic political priority is already out of the way. So now they're looking at a new clean slate that they can evaluate the situation again. And the second factor I would say is the variants that we're talking about. Omicron, in terms of the fatality rate, is significantly lower than its previous variant, like Delta variant, right? So the estimate that the Chinese have made, and a lot of public health experts have made based on the example of Hong Kong opening up, is that given the 1.4 billion population in China, 2 million people most likely will die in the mass scenario of mass infection of Omicron. But I think here the government is trying to change the narrative or change the definition from die of COVID to die with COVID. So among these 2 million people, most of them will have pre-existing conditions that probably will lead to the fatality in the end, but Omicron or the COVID infection certainly would not help. But in this case, I think the government will make the argument that the public health risk carried by the opening up is already significantly lower than before. So compared to the significant political and economic risks and the cost of a zero COVID policy, opening up is justified.
Thank you, Yun. Kristin, sort of bring you into this conversation. I'd be really curious about your take on exactly this dilemma that the government is facing of having to balance this discontent with the public health concerns, and how that also ties in with the economic slowdown that we've seen in China, but globally as a result of the pandemic.
Yes, thank you. of course, very important question. I think we also have to take a step back to see how the regime got itself into that dilemma, right? It's the result of seemingly systemic contradictions. On the one hand, pursuing this strict lockdown, and kind of saying we can open up because we don't have vaccination rates are really low. We are worried about the results in terms of the death toll that Yun has just mentioned. But on the other hand, of course, also not allowing, for example, to import foreign vaccines. Interestingly, seemingly also really struggling to deliver its own RMNR vaccine. Also in terms of production, it's actually a quite challenging process. So actually, it's also kind of the result of the systemic contradiction that Xi Jinping has put himself into. And to me, it's really astonishing to how that could happen, actually. I think also because we started the conversation with talking about the sweep of Xi Jinping. I think, for example, in Germany, we paid a lot of attention about his capacities to kind of oust his competitors, that he was able to fill all the positions with loyal people, but we didn't pay so much attention to his, I would say, very obvious weakness to deliver on key governance projects, right? He didn't have much of a success story to present. Belt and Road is increasingly, the infrastructure outreach is increasingly challenging, and the COVID policy too. So I think that's also really important to see what this could mean for China looking forward. I think it will be honestly a very tough challenge ahead. I think I agree with Yun that they try to shift the narrative. Also adding to that, what just Yun said is kind of saying, now it's the responsibility of everybody. It's this Chinese slogan, Ren Ren Yong. So now everybody, you have to be more responsible. Also saying, well, COVID, you can manage if you kind of eat healthy and keep social distancing. So obviously trying to shift part of the blame then also to the Chinese people itself. But let's face it, 2 million deaths, also probably really overburdening health system. That will be really challenging to communicate and to maintain mid to long. And it's winter. I mean, it's not spring and summer. So that, of course, also adds additional pressure.
So before we went live, one of you said, you know, it looks like this might be too little too late, right? This decision has come fairly late. It was sort of clear it couldn't really come before the party conference, so it has come after the party conference. Do you think it is too little too late? And Kristin, maybe you first, and then Yun.
Sure. Again, totally, but again, I think it tells rather the story of the ideological kind of corner that Xi Jinping moved him, and his advisors seemingly also moved himself and themselves into. Again, he personally took responsibility, and he also for some time quite successfully, and many people in liberal democracies also believe that China has a superior approach to handling the pandemic, or to be a lot better in terms of crisis management, more efficient, right? That initially, after, of course, the initial chaos that he produced and the responsibility, but then that was a success story for quite some time. And then to this strict zero COVID policy, putting his name, linking it to him personally, it was really tough. It has been tough for him to really significantly change that. Although we, of course, also learned a little that it also created some discussions within the wider elites. Li Keqiang and others earlier saying we need to open up. This is really going tough on our economic growth dynamic. So yes, too little too late, but rather that's the result of a person, a leader, which is very ideological and seemingly not as skillful, I think, as we thought or hoped in terms of governance, and also questioning, of course, what does he actually get? Does he see those models? Do his advisors tell him what's really going on the ground? How much does he know about the protest and things? That's, of course, also always a question when we talk about those kind of omnipresent leaders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yun, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. So when we say too little too late, this next thing that follows is better late than never, right?
Right.
So I think if you look at the genesis of the Chinese COVID control policy domestically, I think now people would recognize, like Kristin just mentioned, that earlier on the Chinese control, the lockdown, the zero COVID policy, it was effective. And it was quite successful in terms of defending the population against this pandemic. But things changed with Omicron, because this is a new variant with much less fatality rate, but also with much more contagious capability. So it infects more people, but the result of the infection is not as deadly as as previous variants entailed. So now I think people's question really is that, could China have opened a little bit earlier? Yeah. And not suffer the public health, the mass casualty or the mass fatality associated with a previous variant. But of course, there's no counterfactuals in historical events, so we cannot turn back the clock. But I think now people's focus, one, is on, does China have to wait this long? Or could it have actually reopened earlier in 2022 without getting into the same public discontent or the human suffering that we have seen this year? Because Omicron is simply much more contagious. And the second question is focused on the vaccine. It's focused on the mRNA vaccine. That does Chinese government have justification to continue to reject Western mRNA vaccine, knowing the efficacy is much higher compared to the Chinese vaccine? And I think that's the policy debate that I think worth more attention. If China is rejecting, for example, Pfizer vaccine, why? Right. Is it because they believe that, well, there's a model of the competition for superiority, that the Chinese vaccine needs to be at least as good as a Western vaccine? Otherwise, it's a matter of inferiority for China. If that was the case, if that was the explanation, I would say then the policy making is still quite problematic, because it's not driven by the concern for human lives. It's driven by the concern of the ideology and the optics of inferiority. So I think that's the more debatable issue here.
So I guess let me fold in a viewer question, and I have a sense of what your response might be to it, given what you were just saying about the efficacy of the different vaccines. One of our viewers in Los Angeles actually writes, China has prevented many COVID deaths and hospitalizations by harsh restrictions on the movement of people. In the US, we've loosened restrictions, and America is now facing surges in infections. Which country has the best chance to quell the disease? I mean, I guess part of it has to do with the restrictions, but part of it also has to do with which vaccines are available to the public.
I would say definitely, as Yun already said, the whole issue of being able to choose to deploy the best, so to say, medical tools that are available in terms of medication, but of course, first and foremost, vaccines. I do think also looking at it, and I agree with Yun, I think we do have to look at it from a systemic ideological point of view too. I think, honestly, looking back now in hindsight, so to say, that liberal democracies proved themselves to be quite resilient because of the simple fact that we were able to correct mistakes, that it was painful that it took so long, especially also in Europe, but we were able to include many stakeholders. So we didn't have that. Of course, we also did have anti-COVID demonstrations, but I think we were able, liberal democracies were able to kind of improve as we went along, which seems to be much more sustainable in terms of learning to live with the virus. Also not having, which I think is also will be a huge factor in China, not creating another kind of social panic. You know, once, especially in smaller places, people would see other people dying, hospitals. I mean, we had those kind of mass panicking movements throughout the Chinese history. And I think in that sense, liberal democracies are more prepared in the midterm to also learn to live and to deal with the virus than a totalitarian system like China.
I agree. So if I can just add to that, I'll just say that, well, it depends on the criteria. How do we evaluate success, right? So is it just a public health matter? Do we just look at the fatality rate? We ignore the human suffering and the human misery that was accompanied in the draconian COVID lockdown policy? I mean, people were rejected at the hospital because they don't have a negative test, a negative PCR test. And the kids, well, there was a particular sad case last month in the city of Lanzhou, that a boy 3 years old was gas leak at home, and his parents hoped to rush him to the hospital, but the local police wouldn't let them leave the neighborhood because he doesn't have a negative PCR test. And the saddest part about this boy is that he was only 3 years old. He lived his whole life under COVID lockdown. He was never able to go anywhere. So he basically lived his whole life in the COVID pandemic. And how do you evaluate that cost or that loss of basically a human life and human happiness? So I feel that in the end, the decision has to be made on a comprehensive basis. It's not just about how many people died or did not die. It's also about public satisfaction. It's about what kind of policy is in fact acceptable in, say, a Western democracy. Like here in the United States, government cannot even force people to do the vaccine, right? So there are complaints about, well, how is the government really protecting human life? But with the individual liberty that we respect and also the individual rights that we honor, there are certain policies that are applicable in China are simply not going to be feasible here in the United States. So I feel that this simple comparison, let's just look at how many people died or how many people did not die, just ignore so many different factors. And it's not a fair comparison, and it's comparing apples and oranges.
So Yun, that's actually perfect, because this question of sort of what's acceptable, how high is the public discontent, how high is public satisfaction, leads to another domestic topic that I wanted to bring up before handing over to Katja to sort of widen the aperture and look at the international dimension. And that is, Kristin, you published a piece relatively recently about youth unemployment and the desire of young people to secure jobs in the public sector. And I'm wondering about this whole issue around employment in general, and the future that youth have, or the perceived future that they have, when the economy slows down, when there's a lack of opportunity, and whether you think that the rollback of some of these disruptive regulations might sort of change the interest of young people in finding those public sector jobs. I mean, has the view of government changed? Have the opportunities that people have perceived changed as a result of some of these policy shifts, if you will?
Yes, and indeed, I think it's a very diverse and oftentimes also very ambiguous findings we do see here. I think in general, also just linking it what Yun just said, I think those kind of cases Yun just described, I think also really shake the trust of especially also the younger generation in not only the local officials, like, oh, it was wrongly enforced, that was the previous narrative, but also in the system per se, like the state doesn't care about us, about our lives. And of course, and that has to be seen in the next month, if that would kind of lead to kind of stop that previous tendency that people would rather leave the private IC sector, which has been object to a harsh regulation and crackdown by the Chinese government. So there was a lot of insecurity, which kind of led young people to turn to more secure positions within the party state. It has to be seen if that will be continue. Indeed. Then also, interestingly, there has been this whole movement of laying flat, like people just saying, we're so much part of this also party state enforced, keep yourself busy, earn money, but don't think about politics, don't complain as long as you make money. People are trying to break out from this, so to say, cycle of burnout oftentimes. And then also younger people are increasingly looking for jobs which are more like independent in the sense of being able to manage your own time, to rather earn a little less, but then being freelancing in particular sectors. So a lot of mixed signal, but I think also indeed a lot of insecurity. And I mean, this whole issue of 润学, who can leave the country, run. It's a pun actually on the English word to run away. That's also has been a huge issue, and people are still looking into those. So very mixed, a very, I think, young generations also searching for how to manage and to maneuver life in those very challenging times. Even with the slogan, we may be the last generation, people are saying we're the last generation. We don't want to have kids because the whole future looks so bleak. We really don't know how to handle this.
Can I just add one piece of data to this? So if you want to look at what the Chinese youth are really thinking, you look at the number of applicants to the civil service exam every year, right? And this exam is hosted in late November every year. It's basically the one opportunity in the year that you can apply for civil service jobs. So this year, the total applicant was 2.59 million. So basically 2.6 million people, which represents a 25% increase compared to last year. Last year, it was only 2 million people, but every year it just goes up. I think what that demonstrates is that when the job market is so uncertain and the economic prospect of the country remains unknown, civil service is still regarded as the most secure positions and the best jobs the young people can get. And remember, this happened in the context of the COVID lockdown, right? I think for us now living in China, we can't really comprehend what it means to be under lockdown. Under lockdown means that you cannot go out of your home. It means you definitely cannot go to work. And when you're not going to work, you are not getting paid. So for the private sector jobs that you're not doing, people lose their salary. But there is an exception that if you are a government employee and you are under lockdown, you're at home, you still get paid. So I think just for that very simple reason, the financial stability associated with the civil servant's job, it explains why government jobs are still being chased after by the younger population. And I feel that this 25% increase of the applicants to just take the civil servants entrance exam is a very good manifestation of that mentality.
Thank you so much, and I think we could spend the rest of the 1 hour that we have talking about the domestic politics, because what you just said, people are not being paid, and so they don't have a means to carry themselves, and that I think was one of the slogans of the so-called bridgemen, who kind of like started the protest saying, we don't want tests, we want food. We don't need tests, we need food. And another so interesting aspect, Kristin, is what you said about the demographic challenges that China is facing, with the young people saying, they don't want to have kids, it's too uncertain. The situation is too bad. So of course that leads to a whole layer of complication for the government. But we let's still bring this conversation to the international dimension. Kristin, you already kind of alluded to that a little bit, mentioning the Belt and Road Initiative and the problems that the Chinese government is facing with your signature economic initiative. But let me start with a viewer question, and I'm just going to read the question. As Xi begins his third term, will domestic issues like COVID and growth consume his attention, or do you anticipate him using a muscular foreign policy, for instance, against Taiwan and in the Indo-Pacific, to distract from speed bumps in China's emergence from COVID and its growth recovery? And second question is, given that US-China tensions are not easing anytime soon, even if not worsening, what do you see China doing in terms of a charm offensive towards the rest of the world, including Europe? And will this at all be successful? So I don't know, whoever wants to jump in first, go ahead.
Happy to give it a start, and then please Yun correct me or add to that, or both correct and add. First question, Taiwan, very important question. I mean, even before this latest kind of conflict, domestic pressure due to the protests, I think the likelihood was also, especially by US expert, was kind of increased that Xi Jinping may take kind of measure against Taiwan, and especially, of course, if domestic pressure rises, that's a well-known pattern. On the other hand, though, of course, it's much more challenging. I think the comparison with Ukraine and Russia is also not quite adequate to the degree of the complexity of what that would mean to kind of attack Taiwan. Would it be a blockade? Would it be a kind of cyber war-led partial kind of induced, so to say, warship, or two planes would collide or whatsoever? So provocative act, so to say. I think that that's something which can clearly not be ruled out, and indeed the danger may increase as Xi Jinping gets more aggressive, if he's more under pressure within the party, also not only by popular protests, but if we do see a stronger split or a stronger backlash from the political elites on his non-deliverance of many policy promises he has made. I think so. I think it's a really likely scenario. A charm offensive. So on the other hand, I mean, we partly do see this ongoing, and unfortunately, especially my own country, Germany, is quite receptive to that. Also, of course, in terms of the economic dependency, Xi Jinping is still playing on that, is happy to welcome European leaders, lately also Charles Michel, of course. So I'm not sure if you would call this a charm offensive already, but at least playing on the European and especially German receptiveness of still wanting and saying needing to cooperate with China. And of course, the ongoing, so to say, charm offensive mixed with economic interest vis-a-vis Africa, Latin America. I mean, this has already been Southeast Asia, very important, the largest trading partner now for China, no longer the US. So they put in a lot of effort to pursue their economics interests and political influencing. So yes, actually, to both questions, likely becoming more important, and we might see an increasing activity on both of those kind of fields.
Do you want to add something, or also, I already had the pleasure of listening to you one time before, and you very well explained the difference between Ukraine and Taiwan about these different scenarios of what Kristin just said to the invasion of Ukraine is not necessarily, you cannot compare one to a possible invasion of Taiwan by China. So if you could explain for our audience again these, why these scenarios are so different.
I think it's very different to begin with. China and Russia are very different powers, right? They have very different strategic culture coming to the, especially the utilization of military operations. I think the Chinese are far more conservative compared to Russia. And if you look at the comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan, well, Taiwan's population is 23 million. China has a population that's 70 times bigger than the Taiwanese population. If you compare the population between Russia and Ukraine, the differential is not nearly that large. And then you compare the geographics. Taiwan is an island. Well, we know that for the Western support, the NATO support for Ukraine to come into the country goes through Poland, goes through Romania. Guess what? Taiwan doesn't have it. Taiwan is an island that will be in the event of a conflict, subject to a Chinese-imposed naval blockade. So for the military assistance and economic assistance to come in, it will require a very different mechanism for that to happen, if it is going to happen. So, but then of course, if you ask the Chinese, the difference is, well, Taiwan is not a country, Ukraine is the country, so there's the whole different debate there. But I thought that the question raised by the audience is a very interesting one. The essential question is that now Xi Jinping has domestic problems. Is he going to resort to foreign policy crisis in order to distract domestic attention? Because in the IR series, there is that series that countries under distress is possible and probable for them to resort to foreign policy crisis in order to resolve domestic political constraint or political issues. I have to say that is not the Chinese experience, because the KMT leader, the former leader of China back in the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek, made a very famous statement about the relationship between foreign policy issues and the domestic political crisis that's still very well known today in China. And he said, 攘外必先安内. To fend off foreign enemies, we have to prioritize taking care of domestic enemies first. So I think that actually reflects in the Chinese strategic culture, there's something, the causality is reverse, that you will see Xi Jinping flexing his muscle or adopting an assertive foreign policy when his domestic political base is relatively solid. But when he faces domestic problems, the danger for him to start a foreign policy crisis is that between foreign policy crisis and domestic governance issues or challenges, he will be cornered. And because for authoritarian leaders, there's always the danger of being challenged by his political opponents. To have two fronts open as vulnerabilities, both domestic and foreign policy, is going to be particularly dangerous for the leader of Chinese Communist Party to put himself in that position. So I would say that if you look at China's assertive behavior, whether it's Chairman Mao launching into the Korean War or the Deng Xiaoping's getting into the Third Indochina War, I would say these all happened when the Chinese leaders felt relatively secure about their domestic standing. And here we're looking at Xi Jinping basically facing economic slowdown and social discontent because of COVID lockdown. And remember, he got his third term, but how the party is absorbing the third term, whether there's going to be quiet oppositions or resistance to his third term, we don't know that yet. So I would say this actually explains why China is adopting such a conciliatory tone that we have seen from all these diplomatic charm offensives. Why China is seeking a detente with the United States after calling US basically the worst country in the whole world for 3 years. I think there is actually a very strong domestic explanation that foreign policy indeed in the end is a manifestation of the domestic strengths or domestic weaknesses that the Chinese leader is facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yunand. And this would just lead me to ask you a little bit more about this détente. And I think in March you wrote that the war in Ukraine could be a window of strategic opportunity for China, sort of in their international outreaches or on the global stage. But before we go into that, there are two more viewer questions, and they kind of tie the domestic threat and the international threat together. So let me ask those two questions. One viewer is interested in knowing, about the Chinese protests. If they reach as far as Urumqi, that's at the Sino-Russian border, if this were to persist, could it have an impact on the Russian-Ukrainian front? And another viewer is interested, is there any sense of a spillover effect in which the actions of Russia is creating a sense of caution or doubt in non-aligned nations towards China's intention internationally? So a little bit of a different take, but I don't know, Kristin, do you want to maybe start?
Sure. So whether or not the protests, they have been, of course, protests like mornings, basically in Urumqi, but then kind of were taken up in Shanghai and Beijing. But I don't foresee any spillover effects like into Russia or kind of sparking new protests within Russia. I think that's probably the issues are, if I understand the question correctly, I think are not really linked to one another. Towards the second question, could you remind me of that again, Katja? Sorry, the second question was on.
Do the actions in Russia, is that creating a sense of out in non-aligned nations towards China? So what's like nations? What's happening?
Right. I think overall, I mean, that's probably also, I would frame it that way. Look, of course, watching how, to what extent China has been supporting Russia, of course, in the first way, that was the first kind of, so to say, entry point for many countries to probably also position themselves in terms of ideological or geopolitical rationale. But then, of course, for many non-aligned countries, the economic relations with China or with the US, I think, are still the first, so to say, layer how to position themselves in that conflict, as long as they can. I mean, currently we do in this bifurcation of geopolitical order, we still do have countries which could be called like fence sitters. You know, some European countries, Turkey, India, interestingly, is also really lately, of course, very cleverly by the US incorporated in this new initiative to create supply chains then for the US around at China. But I think that's probably only one factor. And of course, I think China itself now is also increasingly seemingly unhappy and not very reluctant. And we have seen signs of that to really actively support Russia to a large extent, right? They need Russia as a kind of partner in crime, so to say, against the ideological camp in this bifurcation of global order against the liberal democracies. But I don't think that this has been the most decisive factor for, so to say, non-aligned countries or fence sitters to judge their own relationship towards China or the US.
No, if I can just add to that, first on the border question. First of all, Xinjiang only has a very, very, very short border with Russia. It's something around 50 kilometers. So that's like 30 miles of shared border between Xinjiang and Russia. Mostly is Russia, is Mongolia on the east side and Kazakhstan on the west side. So the shared border with Russia is extremely short. And the Urumqi is I don't know the exact distance, but at least hundreds of miles from that border. So I don't necessarily think that what happened in Urumqi is going to have a spillover effect over the border. But if we're talking about the issue of China-Russia alignment, like they would say alignment but not alliance, because they don't have mutual defense. We don't see China supporting Russia militarily in the war of Ukraine. And by that same token, the Chinese don't expect Russia to lift a finger in the event of a Taiwan contingency, for example. So then you have to worry, then you have to wonder that what kind of alliance is this? But the question here is that we're looking at diverging interests between China and Russia and their converging interest. Like Kristin just mentioned, that they have tremendous convergence of their interest, and the most important one being this shared anti-US agenda, right? US is being perceived as the most significant national security threat for China and the most likely for Russia as well. So that shared agenda forming the foundation for their convergence. And whatever happened in this war in Ukraine is not going to create enough divergence of their interests to outweigh that shared agenda vis-a-vis the United States. And if you look at the attitude from the non-aligned countries, let's look at the non-aligned countries. Let's look at the attitude of India. Let's look at the attitude of Brazil. And look at the attitude from, say, the Middle Eastern countries. I think once we go through specific countries that we're talking about, we realize that their position on Russia is not as satisfactory, if might be the word, as we would desire. And in fact, if you look at the exact number of countries clearly opposing Russia and criticizing Russia, I think there's interesting empirical evidence to be explored as for where these countries really stand, because we cannot make a blanket statement to say, oh, you know what, non-aligned countries or developing countries across the board opposes Russia, because that is simply not true. We have smaller countries like Singapore. Yes, they oppose it very clearly and explicitly. But remember, smaller countries also have a critical concern, which is their own sovereignty and territorial integrity. If they do not oppose this, it could have implications for their future security, right? So I feel that we cannot make this blanket statement. It needs to be very specific. Which country are we talking about and which bloc are we talking about?
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. So you just talked about converging interests and diverging interests and, the united front against the United States. But when you look at atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, so you have this group of countries who legally own nuclear weapons, which includes the United States and then, of course, China and Russia. So there is a mutual interest of all these three states to not change this regime, I would assume. And it would, of course, change if Russia would pull the atomic trigger, because then, of course, there will be many countries who would then acquire atomic weapons, because all this tacit agreement that it will never be used would be blown off. So how does that play into it? So does the US need China to convince Russia sort of to, stay away from that, to maintain the status quo that has basically worked for the last 80 years? Or how do these interests sort of work? Kristin, maybe you want to take it.
Yes, in terms of, that was interesting also from a German perspective. Actually, there has been a lot of attention. I think that was one of the most reported results, so to say, from the meeting between Olaf Scholz and Xi Jinping, that Olaf Scholz kind of, and he claimed that, of course, also kind of downplaying the economic side of things, but he claimed, oh yeah, I made Xi Jinping to spell out that he's against, the nuclear option, or he would agree to be aligned on the fact that we need to know Russia. That's not a good idea, to pull the nukes, basically. And I think clearly, of course, I think from a Chinese point of view, sure, this has also been before. I think there was no indication that China was really happy with the way, as the longer the war kind of continued and the more aggressive and desperate, you could also say, the Russian government got, that China in its own interest was really in favor of that. So I think, of course, there is an alignment, I think, between the US and China, of course, also that this wouldn't be a good idea. And I think it's not to put it that one would need the other to convince China of that. I think that's kind of really, there's an agreement on that specific point. So actually it was also not too surprising for me that Xi Jinping would spell out that he is, of course, also not kind of supporting any nuclear options of Russia in Europe. Of course, although kind of spelling that out was a kind of something that he may have offered Olaf Scholz for all the huge economic gains that also China could kind of secure.
Yeah, that is definitely regarded that was one of the two main deliverables from the trip, right? The most important one being, China said no use of nukes to Russia, basically. But I think the context of that is before the visit, basically around October, November, both the US and the Chinese assessments of the probability of Russia using nuclear weapons is very low. It exists. Nobody can eliminate that possibility, right? But the probability is regarded as extremely low. So for China to come out to say this, of course, is regarded as quite a change of position, because Europe did ask China to make an independent statement that we oppose use of nukes as early as March. And China refused back then. So 8 months later, for China to come out and say this, you have to imagine that how Putin feels about this, right? I may not use the nuclear option, but I would like to have that option available. So now for China to say that you oppose it, which means that if I do choose to use it, there's going to be consequences. And that's definitely regarded as a snub of Russia's position. And it takes away another option from the Russian toolkit. So I do see this as it is a significant change of China's policy. But on the other hand, we also know that the probability is quite low. And at the same time, the Russians have other means like aerosol bombs or other thermal options that they could pursue the same mass effect on mass destruction without the use of nuclear weapons. But still, between China and Germany, I think, yes, Chancellor Scholz has described this or portrayed this as a tremendous deliverable and diplomatic success on Germany's part. And I think the Chinese agree.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. But before we maybe come to the question of what does the US think about it, let's just ask one quick question concerning sanctions and energy to conclude this, topic for the international consequences. So just energy and sanctions. I think we've seen unprecedented sanctions put in place. Are these effective? Do they deter anyone from doing anything? Or what's happening? maybe going back to the illusion of a window of strategic opportunity for China, now that Russia is sanctioned so much and it can buy cheap energy, what's going on in China with regard to these two things?
I can share some of the data, but my data needs to be updated. For the first 9 months of the year, the Chinese crude oil import from Russia increased by 7%. That's by volume. That's by the sheer tonnage, right? The barrels. But if you look at the total value, it increased by more than 50%. Why? Because the price is just so much higher. So although China is not importing significantly more barrels of crude oil from Russia, the value, the money that China actually paid Russia has gone up significantly, which is why by the end of this year, we're in December, when we look at the bilateral trade data, we're going to see a significant jump of the bilateral trade, especially Russian export to China this year. And last year was 147 billion US dollars. This year, I think there's a very good potential. It will be over 180 or even 200 billion US dollars, because the energy resources are simply that much more expensive this year. And you could then argue that, yes, it does create revenue for the Russian war effort, yes. But I'm sorry to say, but the rest of the world, whoever buys oil from Russia is also doing the same thing. And if you look at the financial consequences of the war, the financial collapse of Russia did not happen. Why? Because they are able to maintain a pretty large trade surplus this year because of the energy, the hike of the energy price. So a country's financial health eventually depends on how much foreign reserve they have on their bank account, right? And so this year, again, the Chinese are, of course, learning the financial and economic consequences of the war in preparation for potential Taiwan contingency. And when they look at the Russian data, the conclusion inevitably is, unfortunately, that, well, staging the war has not really led to the collapse of the Russian financial system, because, or the Russian foreign trade, because of the dependence on Russian energy. The future, of course, does not look particularly promising. If you think about the sanctions, especially the technological sanctions on Russia, but that's also not what the Russian economy has been famous for. Their comparative advantage has always been with their energy resources, right? So with this level of dependence, yes, China is importing more, but I feel that every customer of Russian oil is contributing to Russia's trade surplus this year. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think of kind of, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Steve.
Go ahead, please.
No, just also taking, I mean, the topic of sanctions, of course, is very relevant regarding the whole issue of Russia, Ukrainian war, but also taking the topics of sanctions back to the US-China relationship. I think from that angle, of course, for the Chinese government, the sanctions from the US have been significant in terms of access to an increasing number of really high-tech components. That's for China, this has of course been the larger issue, so to say, adding to the experience that Yun just described, watching how the Russian sanctions would impact Russia. But I think China has been feeling this much more significantly, of course, because it concerns them more directly. And I think from a European or from a German point of view, mostly from a Dutch, but also from other countries' point of view, of course, still being partly able to, due to the fact that the US currently doesn't enforce the third party, so to say, sanctions, very, of course, increasingly pressuring, and from a US point of view, also understandably pressuring European countries and companies to get more aligned here. And also, for example, working out the whole issue of Huawei, which is still pending as far as I know. I also try to get a clear understanding. I think the German government still hasn't come up with a final word on this. There's some signs that telecom and other telecommunication carriers have been kind of subtracting Huawei components, right? And people are also calling this is a new dependency in the telecommunication sector. So I think the whole issue of sanction, transferring it back to the transatlantic China policy, is a huge issue, increasingly a point of pressure and tension between the US and Europe. And also, but of course, also, I think really a point of concern for China itself.
So we are rapidly running out of time, unfortunately, and this is such a rich conversation. I'm sorry that it will have to come to an end, but I'd like to try to maybe fold in two final thoughts, final points. The first one sort of brings together this international piece that we've been talking about with some of the domestic concerns as well that we were talking about at the beginning. And I'd like to talk very briefly about China's Belt and Road Initiative. You had a piece in the Wall Street Journal recently, and you talked about Chinese foreign investment and made the case that the Chinese have to come to terms with the fact that recipient countries are often unstable and that they have fragile internal politics, but also weak economies. One of our viewers is curious whether some of these countries are countries that China has tried to provide with its COVID vaccine as a way of sort of winning favor in those countries. I'd be interested, Yun, if you could start by talking a little bit about this dynamic of how China is dealing with some of these European countries that have some internal weaknesses as well, both in terms of their economy and in terms of their political structure.
That's a great question. So it goes to the essential question that has China adopted a divide and conquer strategy in Europe, right? To buy off those countries with, say, more financial or economic vulnerability,
right?
Countries that could potentially become more pro-China and advocate for a pro-China position within EU. And I think that has been a real concern, and we have seen that transpire in some cases. But also at the same time, you also realize that not all the Chinese commitments transpire. So for example, under the framework of the 16+1 or 17+1, a lot of the commitments that the Chinese made at the beginning did not transpire in the end, because they don't believe their economic commitment were reciprocated by the agreed political reciprocity. So for the Chinese to have also learned the lesson that, oh, well, for the disbursement of our economic commitment is going to be paced. The Chinese no longer deliver everything in one front load of in one batch anymore. So their delivery actually has to match the domestic or the political reciprocity from the recipient countries as well. And that really, I feel that has disillusioned a lot of countries in this process, that, well, China promised, but not everything was delivered in the end anyway. But the vaccine diplomacy is a slightly different matter. In 2020 and 2021, I would say the Chinese vaccine were very popular because there was a shortage of vaccine. This was at a time that there was a shortage of supply. And remember, developed countries were prioritizing domestic markets, right? Pfizer vaccines were basically vacuumed, was completely taken by the United States and by European countries. So when we look at developing countries, they did not have a supply. And during this period, I would say the Chinese vaccines played a huge role in this vaccine diplomacy that China used to demonstrate our benevolence, because remember, China was under lockdown. They did not, at least for the very beginnings, they did not need as much vaccine domestically. So they were happy to provide vaccine to, for example, Indonesia, to Bahrain, to Brazil. But the problem of that is it also came back to bite China later, because when it was determined that the efficacy of the Chinese vaccine was inferior to the mRNA vaccines as Western producers were gradually putting on the market, the Chinese vaccine became the symbol of inferior solution or inferior vaccine on the market. And I don't think that really presented a very positive image for both the quality of the Chinese product and also the benevolence or the leadership role that China was trying to project. So it's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, just what Yun's been saying, when we're thinking ahead of the leadership role of, for example, the US versus China, and who will be more impactful to really structure and impact global order. I think the whole topic of alliances or allies, or being able to create sustainable, so to say, partnerships, not on short-term gains, like as you just described. I mean, that's also a capacity, of course, diplomacy in terms of really short-term being able to mobilize or to kind of use the situation to your advantage. But the question for me really is, for example, we now have this global security initiative by China. We've talked a bit about the Belt and Road Initiative and the strengths and also the weaknesses of that, especially lately. And then in terms of the economic realm, of course, from the United States, this new Indo-Pacific economic framework. And I mean, I'm not at all an expert on this, but I've been surprised how it seemingly works out quite well. A lot of countries were supportive. We have talked about India because they also see that's investment that creates jobs, right? Although that's maybe then also cater the supply chain of the US. So, I mean, for me, really looking ahead in terms of how global order will evolve, one key element is really to what extent will those two larger powers will be able to create alliances, really allies. And as Yun also said, I mean, Russia is not really an ally of China, right? It's a kind of partner in crime. I don't know if that's a good term to use, but I think that's really for me a key factor when we're looking ahead, you know, in terms of being able to shape a global order and to create not only economic dependencies but also political, like really trustworthy allies and partnerships.
I mean, I think from what you're saying, obviously those two countries are very different and are not in an alliance, but they sometimes have a common agenda or some common goals. And that's where we see some alignment between them as they try to disrupt the Western democracies and sort of poke at them a little bit. And so we will have to be asking this question that you just posed for years to come as we see how the global order shakes out. This has been an incredible conversation, and I feel like we have covered a lot of territory, but that there are also a lot of issues that we have not gotten to. You know, one of the questions that Katja and I had wanted to talk about with both of you had to do with internal communication, the way in which the Chinese government is shaping information and what sort of fallout that has for people. We also did not really get to the bilateral relationship between Germany and China and the US and China and how those are perceived. These are topics that obviously need to be addressed again, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to do that on a future occasion. I'd maybe like to ask you, one final question if your time allows. And it has to do with a little bit of a historic perspective. Katja brought up the bridge man, who we've heard something about in recent weeks, who has been sort of a pivotal point for the current protests that we're seeing. He's been compared to a certain degree with the tank man, who we all remember from 1989 and Tiananmen Square. And I guess the question I have for each of you as longtime China watchers is, are there parallels between what we're seeing unfold right now in terms of some of the shifts in the government's domestic politics and what we see coming out of Tiananmen Square in 1989 and early 1990? We could probably spend a whole hour talking about that, but if either of you have sort of a 30-second, 1-minute response, that would be wonderful.
I don't yet, because I think this will have to evolve a little bit further for us to really draw that conclusion. Because yes, there has been that bridgman, but remember, his political calling or his political protest had nothing to do. Well, it was not nothing to do, but it was not directly targeted at the COVID restriction. So I feel that there are several different strings that we're talking about. There are people unhappy with Xi Jinping and his policy, and there are people who are more focused technically and specifically on the COVID restriction policy. And if you ask me, I would say the majority of the people that we see are not happy with the COVID policy, but it doesn't mean that can be translated or that equates to a direct opposition to the government and Chinese Communist Party. I think we're far from that.
Mm-hmm.
I do agree, and adding analytically and also, again, looking ahead, I think one factor that also really differs from the 80s is the whole elite, so to say, alignment or non-alignment. I think we've seen a much more, maybe it was more visible, but it seems to me that in the 80s, the elites, there was a lot of more sympathy for liberal ideas. There were also, I mean, there was a whole different international environment also in terms of democratic transitions ongoing. And I mean, there's no, also in terms of really opposition towards or like sympathy with some of the wider political demands of the students, for example, this time. At least we don't see it, maybe not yet, but yeah, that would be, of course, a crucial factor in a split of the political party of the elites. That would really then trigger some of the change that I think many of us, and I believe also Chinese people, hope for. You know, not a hardening one-man dictatorship, but at best, at least a return to collective leadership with more internal balancing out and prevention of really extreme, harsh measures, both domestically and also internationally.
Well, Kristin and Yoon, on behalf of both 1014 and the American Council on Germany, I really want to thank both of you for taking the time for this incredibly thoughtful conversation. As I said, it's been very rich. I have certainly learned a lot, and I hope that our viewers have as well. I also want to thank our viewers for all of the great questions that you submitted. Keep the questions coming when we do these kinds of events. And both Kristin and Yoon, herzlichen Dank, many thanks. I hope that our paths cross again in the not too distant future, but this has really been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.